Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Luca Tremolada, and I am a journalist for Il Sole 24 Ore, and I will be your moderator during this second day and second working session from RTB. And the title of this panel is Green and Just Transition, Preparing a Sustainable Future for a Fair Society. We have as our guest Ellie Schlein, Vice Chairman of the Emilia-Romagna Regional Authorities. Then we have Maria Chiara Carrozza, Chairman of the Italian Research Center, and then Giulio Loiacono, Coordinator and Operator for the Italian Agency for Sustainable Development. Now, we've examined data in preparation for this panel discussion and have seen how the COVID pandemic is polarizing social inequalities. And in this polarization process, which is a global process and it doesn't just concern Italy, it concerns the whole world. Of course, we have the environment and ecology. In Italy, there's been much militancy with happy degrowth, and now there is an attempt to make this ecological transition something more rational. It's about sustainability and think about or rethink one's organization and business in a totally different approach. I'd like to stem from this concept and call to express her ideas Maria Chiara Carrozza. We've seen figures lately on how small investments are for research in Italy. Despite everything that we've had and seen, it is not a country that invests much in basic research. But at the same time, the role that you have in the Italian research or the National Research Center is to transfer knowledge and know-how to new technologies, new processes that will have to be implemented for the ecological transition. What is your position? What is your outlook? Everyone is focused on you, and I don't think that much has changed compared to the past years. First of all, thank you very much for having invited me to this panel discussion. This is an important discussion to discuss what the different players are doing, not just the government that has the most important role right now. The government's role is that of having approved and then implementing the resilience and recovery plan, and also the investment of the European funds, and prepare the whole system to be more proactive in spending well these European funds. So, to answer your question, during moments of crisis, we know that what matters are the private-public alliances, public-public alliances, to make do and to make up for the shortages on the market, especially in periods of crises, and the pandemic crisis is, of course, one of these. Now, we have more than 8,000 employees and 88 institutions. This is us as CNR. We are communicating and discussing the different levels of competencies. We are mapping our competencies right now, and the institutes from the different industries are coming together for ecological transition. We have engineering institutions, for instance, that deal with robotics, AI, technology at large. And then there are institutions, scientific institutions, that are studying the effects of climate change. They know the oceans, they know about the oceans and land, and polar sciences as well. And then we have scientists that deal with the green transition in chemistry, green chemistry, new materials, new processes in manufacturing, and for the production of energy, for instance, hydrogen. Now, I could go on listing things such as this for hours. We are therefore preparing, but the government is also providing guidelines on priorities. As a matter of fact, this is exactly what I wanted to focus on. CNR, the Italian research center, ranges from climate change to artificial intelligence. You deal with several issues concerning research, 360 degrees. Of course, there's a first and there's a later. Times have changed, and not just for this government, the whole world now has a vocation towards priorities. The right word is priorities. The inequalities, the title of this panel is For a Better, More Equitable Society. Following the G7 summit these days and the meeting between Putin and Biden, the focus is better than in other periods on what priorities are. And of course, the environment is one of these priorities, not only for climate change, but my impression is that for once we are working as a team globally on some issues and themes. What have you been, what has been the request put to you? And the second question is, how are you going to organize yourself, considering that you are sitting uh, on a machine which is complex? CNR is complex. CNR deals with several things, and so I don't envy your position, if you like. Well, first of all, we are a complex machine, but a beautiful machine as well. We have 7 departments and we cover everything. We have researchers, many researchers. When we move hundreds of researchers. We can make the difference. But this comes also with accountability, with if you can make investments in public research, you have to then bring back the value to society. And the government has already told us what is required. Minister Messa delivered a very interesting presentation to all the research directors, and she started expressing an important government position. I have it here before me. So let me comment on this agenda, as they say in the European Commission. The European Commission, when expert groups work, they work on noted agendas. So this is the noted agenda. So there will be fundamental research. There will be calls for tender similar to those of the European Research Council. In Italy, we will examine our champions, who are the best researchers, and understand what infrastructure is needed to meet these calls and to better manage these projects. This is important because, as you say quite rightly, the strategy phase means organizing to manage the funds. This is what we're doing. We're trying to identify the best researchers that can best respond to the call for tender. Although everyone can attempt because there's a freedom for research, but selecting the most promising is the work of the presidency. And then we examine partnerships. I am conducting visits on the territory with researchers. You have to meet them in their single locations. I don't believe in the virtual communication for these things. So I am established here in Rome. So I've been to the PISA CNR offices. I've been to Lecce, I'm going to Bari, I've already been to Milan, and this is how I have started meeting the other players. Now, partnerships are key for this resilience and recovery plan. They are not funds top down. These will be calls for tender that require cooperation, huge cooperation. For me, the novelty is that there is a support towards this idea. As I was saying earlier, I am favorable to alliances between the public and the private sectors. What do I mean by this? For instance, will be a need for alliances between theoreticians. Ms. Giannotti is one of the major researchers on this theme. I mentioned her because I like her. She is a woman. She just won an important award. So, along with her, there are dozens of other researchers. They are the people key for certain research. Uh, and then it has to be combined with artificial intelligence and biomedicine. And then we will meet with those who deal with ecological transition, energy, because AI will become a transversal technology for several areas. Since we're talking about sustainability, an important area is the fact that to understand that we have huge potentials to use data for public interest. We have not yet used all medical data to really have a correct epidemiological analysis on what the responses have been throughout society on this pandemic. So it's a question of creating an analysis for the examination of health data. So we are meeting with epidemiologists, people that are accustomed to examining scientific data. I'm a journalist on data. I founded InfoData. I would open these up, this data, I would open it up as an open source for all citizens. It's not a question of emulating researchers as citizens, but this pandemic has taught us that data are common domain. They should be common domain. So having transparency on this is key. Before we continue, let me ask you another question related to the fact that Italy, you know Italy very well. It's always been complicated to bring together universities in Italy and universities and research centers, and then the private sector. Very complex, all this. There's a great deal of parochialism in Italy, and there is much um, debate, even in the academic community. I'm sure that you agree with the fact that we need a coordination center and that CNR could be the candidate as the pivot for all this coordination. And I'm thinking of AI in particular. On AI, there are research centers, universities, departments. It is really complex to bring together this world. You know this world better than I. What is your idea with regard to the governance of the process? I don't like coordination centers, if I have to be honest. I don't like them because I'm very schematic in my approach. I think that the coordination center should be in the hands of the competent ministers. I trust the government, and I know that competent ministers, the research minister, Minister Cingolani, Arao, have plans that they have shared, and they then respond to Parliament. So I wouldn't create extra infrastructures, but rather I would therefore give the decision-making process, the final decision, to the ministries, to the government, because the government and public interest is very delicate right now. On the other hand, creating a recovery plan for research where there are two measures, enhancing uh, research measurements, the creation and the strengthening of ecosystems for innovation with resources allocated with partnerships, public, 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 private. They have already been told us that we either create these alliances or we're left out of the game. And I don't think that everybody has yet understood this. This is a very strong message from central government. Now, what I like about this approach is that, on the one hand, the research ministry tells us we're going to do programs with young and adult researchers through the European Research Grant, free with a single individual that asks or makes the request for research, basic research. And so the researcher at CNR, all the researchers individually will be free to answer the calls for tender. My role is to make the infrastructure available to spend the money in a timely fashion and correctly. And this is not easy because we have a set of rules with a school system, with a ministry, but for ministry and school, but not for research. So we have to make it feasible for research. On the other hand, they tell us we have to enforce the ecosystem, and therefore we need partnerships, ecosystems, and so on. If you don't have alliances in this area, we can't do much. The system is a hub and spoke system. There will be a coordinator, but then there will be people who will lead towards the coordination centers through the spokes. So I believe in the competence centers. The hub has an important role of coordination, which is very strong because the rules to spend public money will never be too simple. You can't do away with administrative law because this guarantees transparency and correctness. So we have to be prepared for a huge effort in management of all this process. And so there will be opportunities for those who are involved in innovation law. This is the time for jurists to really prove that they understand the importance and the strategy of this government and make the rules transparent but easier to manage. This is not a small challenge. Let's welcome Ellie Schlein, Vice Chairman of the Regional Authorities here in Emilia-Romagna, to join this discussion. What is happening is that this recovery and resilience plan is now being examined, considered, and I say financial flows have to be traced. This is a role for journalists as well. We want transparency on where and how this money is going to be spent. But the challenge for the CNR president is important. We have to rewrite the law, the rules, to understand where the funds are going to be going.
Absolutely, yes. Thank you for inviting me. It's for me a pleasure to be here. And e-meeting President Carrozza was a pleasure to listening to you, and then it will be a pleasure to listen also to Mr. Lo Iacono in order to plan the monitoring of Agenda 2030. So the recovery plan is a great opportunity. Of course, everyone knows that. But I like to focus on my personal life for a moment. Before becoming president of the region, I worked at European Parliament for 5 years. And so I know how difficult it is for them to establish limit conditions on the use of these funds. But so what I want to say is that we are not Italy will not receive this fund indiscriminately. It will depend on three pillars. So first of all, digital transformation, social cohesion, and technological change. So these are the three pillars which need to be found, which need to characterize Italian actions. I believe that the problem over the last few years is that we haven't been able to manage the social processes. What I'm trying to say is that technological innovation, and given my generation, of course, I think that technology has made our lives easier, but I believe that what has missed it was the capacity of politics to spread technological benefits throughout the population. An example, the more the technological information, the more technology is able to know better the needs of our community and territories, the more useful it will be. So this will be very important to meet the people needs, such as healthcare needs, social needs. So an integrated perspective is what is missing, and really data technology can provide for that. Uh, our region, Emilia-Romagna, is receiving important technological facilities. We are seeing this also, for example, with the Meteorological Center, which will be established in September, the supercomputer Leonardo. So all these facilities put at the service of the whole country and the whole European Union as well. But at the same time, we need to make sure that this technological innovation will spread the benefits throughout the population. Transparency, data transparency is another focal point for them to become a tool of collective intelligence. Indeed, Italy has a strict privacy legislation, therefore, a balance needs to be found, which is quite difficult, even already today, to use, for example, data which are shared by different institutions. So, how can this data be shared? By respecting privacy and simultaneously make these data meaningful. About about the green transition, I like to add something. Green transition needs to be just and fair. So the whole community needs to be accompanied through this process. For example, training, investing in skills, innovation, education, research. And I like to say something. I really look forward to hearing to President Carrozza because we got used to listen to science, to listen to scientific voices, because scientific people are those who have the skills to inform us. We have this has been demonstrated during the pandemic. So, as during the pandemic we relied on scientists, well, we have to rely also when it comes to climate change. We need to rely on them, to listen to them, and based on what they say, laying the basis for a concrete plan. For example, in Emilia-Romagna, we are creating an agreement for the implementation of the recovery plan, but also considering dialogue with social parties. In December 2016, we drew a plan with objectives, including, for example, quality jobs, quality firms, also including green transition. One of the objectives is investing in research and innovation, at least 3% of the GDP. This is the framework shaped by the whole regional system. So all the regional parties agree on that, from university to third sector and environmental associations. So why did we equip ourselves with this framework? Because we know that the decarbonation process needs to be a bottom-up approach and not a top-down, which would be meaningless. So working together, putting our efforts together is important to ensure the success of the decarbonization process, which is the real strategy. As for the recovery plan, is a real revolution also on how we use resources in Italy, because public administrations will have to keep themselves with tools to monitor social, environmental, and gender impact to make sure that these changes contribute to improve people's life, planet's life, but also jobs and entrepreneurship. I have a question coming from the 90th generation. You have quite a difficult and challenging task because when I was a young, ecology, environmental movement was considered as happy growth and so on and so forth. Now, environment is something much more technological. Hopefully, I would like to add, the environmentalists are not people wishing to live in an ideal world. It's not like this. Green transition means applying technologies, investing in technologies in order to produce differently, to change the production system, in order to change the environment, which is quite a challenging message to understand here in Italy, especially in a moment in which inequalities are really boosting. For example, by I have uh, I have read data and figures. For example, yesterday I read one about the new poverty. We have about 180 millions of new poor people, according to the Oxfam. So my question to you, as a representative of your region, how will you be able to communicate that indeed a lot of money will be received, but this money will not translate immediately in jobs, but not all these funds will translate immediately into measures filling the gap, filling the gender gap or the employment gap. This is a focal point indeed, and we insist on that. And Agenda 2030 has already brought a revolution in that, in the field of injustice, inequalities, gender inequalities, and combining all these objectives with environmental objectives to create resilient communities able to tackle climate change's effects. So we insist on the deep connection that there is between injustices and climate change, because those suffering the most the consequences of climate change are the poorest countries, are the developing countries, are those countries that have contributed the least to climate change, and they are paying the consequence, and they are much more affected by the consequences. Let's see, for example, desertification is one important effect. So, focusing now on Italy, those paying the higher price for the lack of green transition, is that part of the population already affected by the previous economic crisis. And there was an environmentalist, Alexander Langer, from the 80s, who said that that green transition will take place when it will be socially desirable. What does it mean? Well, it means that our region, is planning to make public transport free for the youth, so that families can save, thus facilitating and supporting the use of public transport. So when local public transport was made free for homeless people this was precisely the message that we wanted to send. I mean, the weakest part of the population needs to be accompanied in the green transition. So we can convince people to take part in the transition using the resources that we have at our disposal. Let's take the example of the eco bonus, the environmental bonus. This is a win-win tool enabling to save costs on bills, but at the same time protecting and saving environmental resources. This is just one example of what convenience means, but maybe you know this better than me. Part of the global finance is focusing on sustainable finance, and the reason is that the benefits is also shared by companies. Circular economies, what does it mean? What is the circular economy? It means that the waste represents a cost, and if the waste turns into a raw material, then it is not a cost anymore, or giving it a second life. This is the logic. This is what convenience means. And I'd like to answer about another thing. So, because we need innovation and research, because of this reason, we invested firstly on knowledge and skills. Green transition and technological transition is not possible without leveraging on skills and knowledge. Take, for example, agriculture. Agriculture is aware to be one of the first responsible for emissions because of the use of ammonia derivatives. But it is also one of the most struck sectors by extreme weather events. But uh, but they are also aware that specifically in agriculture, we can find the most advanced technologies. Um, for example, the possibility to use panels and energy panels able to produce renewable energy. Or precision agriculture is another example of cutting-edge technology. For example, the possibility to use specific substances enabling to keep biodiversity high without impoverishing the earth. So this is where research plays an important role, and this is where lies our task. And we have two commitments. First of all, carbon neutralization before 2050. So establishing which strategies can reduce emission, how to be funded, and secondly, have 100% renewable energies within 2035. This is extremely challenging, and we need the support of the whole system to succeed. I have a last question, a very important one. I'd like to know from you, do you feel that regions may have not an inactive role? I mean, do you believe that the funds will be managed mainly by the government, or will you believe that regions will contribute to these management funds? Well, we are not happy with the degree of involvement of regions. So I believe that regions are not involved enough at the moment. So the question is, how can consolidate cooperation among all the institutions, so also with governmental institutions, to implement more than 200 billion of investments. And in order to do that, we need regions who know which are the specific territory needs and where investments are needed within the territory. So this applies to regions, to municipalities, but not only this. The pact, the agreement that we established in Emilia-Romagna for job and climate has demonstrated that if we are able to pool our knowledge, to pool our territorial knowledge, well, this knowledge, these skills, this represents an added value, and this is important also for the recovery plan. I believe it is not too late to catch up and share competencies better, and also simplifying bureaucracy, which doesn't mean, of course, reducing legality, but it means finding a way to use resources in a more streamlined and straightforward way, as the previous speaker made it clear. So this is a considerable effort, and it requires local authorities, it requires the participation of regions, local municipalities, and I hope that the government will be able to realize that. Thank you very much. And now I give the floor to Lo Giacomo, coordinator of ASVIS. And the question is, do you believe do you agree with Vice President Schlein? Do you believe that companies can understand that environment and the circular economy can be a benefit for them? So, do you agree with them? You cannot push the. You have to incentivize the donkey to drink from the pond. You cannot oblige it. This is kind of a metaphor. So, do they realize the benefit of that?
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for the invitation. Thank you to Vice President Schlein and to the organizers. This is a difficult question. I think that a process is underway. First of all, we need to distinguish and point out that sustainable development is not just environment, ecology. It doesn't just concern this or circular economy. These are key pillars, such as ecological transition is with regard to the R&R plan, but also there is the social inclusion, as was said earlier, and the economic sustainability aspect. Companies are beginning to understand this. Finance has understood this. A recent IPO of a major home delivery chain, the IPO didn't perform well because the big finance companies didn't think that the rights of the riders were guaranteed. And finance has suddenly become more ethical. Earlier, ethics in finance was a niche, but now this is no longer the case. We now have ESG at the fore of finance. We're talking about environment, social, and governance being important for companies and for investors. They have realized this, and therefore the rights of workers are important, and this because companies are more profitable in the longer term when they respect environmental and social requirements, and when they reduce all these risks, environmental, social, and governance risks. On the other hand, you can also take new opportunities when you are aligned with this rationale and this approach. So I believe that this new awareness is now almost a matter of fact. It has to be pushed further thanks to the directives of the European Commission, which is reducing the threshold for certain incentives for companies that are becoming smaller and smaller. So in Italy, the companies will have to provide reporting, for instance, on ESG, and there are still few companies that report on ESG, but this reporting is being made mandatory for more and more companies, and this is important. Why? Because if a company starts collecting non-financial indicators, therefore, if they start collecting and measuring their social impact, even when it's not mandatory yet, it means that they have developed non-financial metrics flow, and it becomes a control panel, if you like, to meet the stakeholders' needs. And at the same time, it can set targets to improve its metrics with regard to governance, social and environmental elements, and then explain to the stakeholders why those targets were not met. And then this should be extended also to public administration. The work that Ms. Schlein was saying of the Emilia-Romagna region is going in this direction. I don't understand why this is important for an important energy company and why we shouldn't have a sustainability report for an important region. There are examples of this abroad. So I think this would be a wonderful example of the citizen stakeholder and a culture in accountability in general. I think that the pandemic has taught us this key lesson. It has increased the awareness of the general public on the fact that everything is interconnected. So what we've been saying about the economic, social, and environmental elements coming together, the pandemic has made these links evident. It has also made them understandable to the lay persons that an environmental crisis can become a health crisis, and in turn, a health crisis can become a social and economic crisis. This is what happened with the Arab Springs. It became a social crisis and then an institutional crisis, and sustainability as a consequence of this more global awareness is here to stay. It is now part of the financial and non-financial institutions jargon. So everyone is talking about sustainability, and the risk now is that of greenwashing. Political greenwashing, economic greenwashing is the risk. And Mr. Carrozza and Ms. Schlein were saying this earlier, and I agree with them entirely. We have data and partnerships. On the one hand, the engagement, the concrete engagement is measured through the seriousness, reliability, the comparability of data to implement the principles of economic sustainability, and then through partnerships. Our association for sustainable development is an example of how an institution such as ours can grow and grow fast. Secondly, the perception of sustainable development is important. If it is true that the perception of sustainable development is growing in the 2030 agenda, another survey has impressed us. It has segmented the Italian population, and the elite segments are those who provide more importance to sustainable development. The most vulnerable sectors of society are those who say, no, it's not a must now, let's deal with this later after the pandemic crisis. It's considered by certain segments of society as a luxury, in other words. Well, this is exactly what we think is the risk that needs to be avoided. Sustainable development is not an option. It's not something that we can afford and take for granted only during moments of economic growth, but it's the only safe route to undertake a recovery, to come out of the doldrums and crisis we're in, and to create new opportunities. And I think from this point of view, what we need is a common effort, shared effort by the institutions, research institutions, businesses, media, and general public to push this message that sustainable development is not a plus, it's not a luxury, it is the only real key and solution to come out of the crisis we're in. We journalists Greenwashing is now a buzzword. What does greenwashing mean? It means the communication process of being aware of the environment issues. Apple, for instance, that decided to remove the battery chargers from their packaging. Um some, in other words, do this in substance and others in form. Of course, it is becoming a little like a trend, as Giulio Loiacono said. It's suddenly a fad to be sustainable and to understand circular economy. Until a few years ago, environmentalists were seen as the people who were imposing more spending, and they weren't contributing to creating more jobs. So things have changed. What is your fear, Mr. Loiacono, considering that the ball of sustainability is now being played by everyone, all the players, even the large players? What is your role? What is going to be the role of your institution, your association, or association similar to yours? You can be considered as the monitor, as the observatory, but then you don't really have a real control function on topics and themes that need this. That require specific technical knowledge. If we consider the 2030 agenda, it doesn't just concern circular economy savings and CO2 impacts and footprints, but also accountability, reporting, and so on, and other measures. So as a journalist, what I ask of an association such as yours is to help uh, provide the monitoring and control that every stakeholder and player is doing their part. Is this difficult to do now? Do you feel that you are trendy, fashionable as an association, but then you're not functional? We, as an alliance and institution, association, we try and provide a pragmatic approach and contribution. We have, for instance, worked on reclassifying the R&R plan. We've had a public debate on this. It's been a useful contribution that our experts provide to the debate. We have 800 experts that work in work groups with different goals and transversal interactions, and they produce a report that every year measures if and how Italy is meeting sustainable development targets. Then there are other activities involving regions and municipalities. And then, besides an analysis of the budget bill, we reclassify the first and the second R&R plan, and all this is available for free on our website, this material. And we try and understand in these analyses in what way the R&R, the Resilience and Recovery Plan, is contributing to meeting targets. And should the R&R plan meet all the goals for 2026, this alone would not be enough to meet the goals for the 2030 agenda. There are some trends which are historically negative, environmental trends such as the decay of ecosystems or soil consumption, trends for which the R&R plan alone cannot reverse the trends. So what is needed is other instruments. And then we have indicators, we have statisticians that work out composite indicators, and they tell us that for other 4 dimensions, participation to school for infants, public transport, inequality in income, and water supply. For these elements, we're not in line with the 2030 targets. So we are like the sentinel, the democratic sentinel, making sure that if the political and economic choices made in Italy are going in the right direction, we also monitor the consistency of policies. For instance, we marked that in R&R plan, there is no link with the sustainable goals and targets of the 2030 agenda that should be the cornerstone, and then the sustainable development agenda that will be presented at the High Economic and Ecological Forum next year lacks a few things, and we're working also along with the ecological transition ministry, and also other elements have emerged, such as, for instance, a shortage of targets. Talking of data earlier, in the R&R plan, we are missing quality and quantity data, especially for social environmental elements. So when there are no targets, you can't make measurements on the adequacy of the investments and the monitoring. The monitoring has to occur through a full involvement, not only of civil society at large, and this is a request that we make, but through a dialogue and the involvement of all the institutions involved, territorial institutions, and the third sector, along with political institutions, to have an integrated vision of progress being made and therefore implement the consultation process which is required by the European plans. Then there are positive elements of the plan, more focus on emissions, better use of resources, transversality of the three themes, young, South, and gender, and then other national funds and European funds, and the recommendations from Europe over the past year or so. So there's much light, but some shadows, some concerning the environmental dimension, which our work groups have highlighted. If we have time, we can go in greater depth on this. I think that the role of an association such as ours that represents civil society is important. There is a need to raise the bar and provide a more qualified analysis on what is produced by the institutions and not just the institutions. I'd like to thank Giulio Loiacono for your contribution. I'd like to thank Maria Chiara Carrozza and Ellie Schlein for having joined this panel discussion. And let me ask you to meet again. The time has come to an end this afternoon when RTB is back at 4 p.m. with a discussion on platforms, data, and artificial intelligence, new models for social spaces, with Patrizio Bianchi, Luciano Floridi, Minister for Education in Italy, and the other gentleman, philosopher and professor of philosophy at Oxford.